I walked here today from Center City, and it reminded me of a walk that I had taken almost 25 years ago, right by 30th Street Station on this trip. 25 years ago, I stopped at 30th Street Station, and I took a train to Portland, Maine, and a trip that transformed my life. I was there because I was working on mentoring for an organization that studied Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and we discovered that the Big Brother, Big Sister program was making an enormous difference in the lives of kids. There was a 46% difference in kids starting to use drugs, a 50% difference in school truancy, a 33% difference in violent behavior, but there were half as many kids on the waiting list for Big Brothers, Big Sisters as they were being matched with a big sister or a big brother, and it raised a fundamental question: where are the human beings to do those things that only human beings could do? And in thinking about where the untapped human resources in society might reside, I got very interested in the role of older people and started searching the country for programs that were bringing people in this latter part of life together with young people. And that's what led me to the Pediatrics Ward of Maine Medical Center in Portland, Maine, to visit a program called Foster Grandparents, and specifically to visit two women, Aggie Bennett and Louise Casey, who had been foster grandparents on the Pediatrics Ward for over a decade. Aggie was the tall one. She was 4'11". Louise was just behind her at 4'10". And despite their diminutive stature, they played an enormous role in the lives of the kids who ended up at Maine Medical Center, because Maine's a big state, it's a poor state, and if you're seriously ill and a child, you end up going to that pediatrics ward. And oftentimes your parents have to leave after a week or two because they have jobs that they need to keep, other children to take care of. So you're 8 years old, you've got cancer, you're in an institutional setting, and you're alone. And that's where Aggie and Louise came in to play. They became surrogate family to these kids, and they did it for years and years in what should have been their golden years. And it was not an easy job. I remember one time being with Louise after a child had died. In fact, she had promised the parents of that child that the child wouldn't die in a crib. And so she went in and they kept monitoring her, and she held that child in its final hours and minutes. And I remember she said that her heart was aching, but the child didn't die in a crib, it died in her arms. And she told me that she felt that as hard as that was, it wasn't a job, it was a joy, which took me a while to really understand, but I think she felt that as her own time in life grew smaller, she wanted to use that time in a way that mattered most. And it reminded me of a line from a poem called To Be of Use by Marge Piercy. She says, "A pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." And today, we hear a lot about this surplus population of people flooding into the stage of life that Aggie and Louise were in at that time, right? This long gray wave of greedy geezers supposedly taking America to the cleaners, fueling the dependency ratio, loading down future generations with this immense burden. But I came away from those experiences in Portland thinking that there was something else possible. Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Gray Panthers, who lived in Germantown here in Philadelphia, had a wonderful expression. She said, "We don't have a single person to waste." And that was certainly true on that pediatrics ward. And I think it's true more broadly in society. We're in the middle of a demographic revolution and a longevity revolution. Life expectancy in this country has increased 30 years since the beginning of the last century. That's bigger than the increases on all the millennia leading up to this past century. And we're told you go to the doctors and you're supposed to live right and eat cruciferous vegetables and reduce your stress and get exercise so that you can live yet longer. And yet you pick up the editorial pages of the Inquirer or practically any newspaper in the country, certainly the New York Times, And you essentially hear about this gray tsunami that's coming our way, this age quake. It's almost as if the Disaster Channel is sponsoring the entire demographic revolution. So how can it be that the best thing to happen to us as individuals, this longevity that we're investing in and trying to expand as much as possible, turns out to be the worst thing to happen to us as societies and is inevitable? Demography is destiny, we hear all the time. So it's no wonder that we see movies like the Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, which I'm sure some of you watched last year, which is built around the idea of outsourcing the elderly, right? If we've got this huge burden, why can't we just send them someplace else? Or my seatmate over here, who is also an age mate of mine, said that she thought, well, maybe we need to get back to the idea of ice floes that the Eskimos put older people on. Christopher Buckley, the guy who wrote Thank You for Smoking, wrote another book called Boomsday, which proposes euthanasia for boomers at age 70. Their families get iPods and other kinds of benefits, and we get out from under that coming dependency ratio. I'm here to propose an alternative just in case ice flows and outsourcing don't end up working with this vast and growing older population, which is social innovation, which is to radically redesign this period of life that 10,000 people a day are flooding into already, and to do it in a way that transforms what's become the oxymoronic years. You know, when I went to see Aggie and Louise, I was in my late 20s. Now I'm in my mid-50s. I can see 60 from here. It happens almost overnight. And I've discovered that I get senior citizen discounts. I used to be that young person who was interested in older people. Now I'm that old person who's interested in his own generation. We hear about the young old, the working retired. I remember when I was going to elementary school in Northeast Philadelphia, one day the teacher put up a bunch of words on the blackboard. We heard about alliterations and onomatopoeias and oxymorons, these contradictions in terms, and suddenly I had become an oxymoron along with many of those other thousands of people who are flooding into this era. And so I think that the longevity paradox, good for individuals, bad for countries, is rooted in this confusion that we have about a period that's opening up between midlife and anything resembling true old age. We're told 60 is the new 40, right? You're supposed to cling to your fast-fading youth. At the same time, you get these senior citizen discounts. You're officially elderly at 50 or 60, so it's sort of the old 80. At the same time, it's the new 40. What I'd like to suggest is that we split the difference and agree that 60 is the new 60. And this flood of people, you'll all be there quicker than you realize, just like I have discovered, is something entirely new on the landscape, the first denizens of a new period of life. And that idea of inventing life stages sounds counterintuitive. Just invent a season and stick it between summer and fall. Yet it turns out that life stages are fictions. They're not fixtures. They seem like the oxygen in the air. I discovered this when I studied retirement and the creation of the golden years in the last half century. Turns out in the late 40s, Walter Reuther, the great UAW leader, described retirees as too old to work, too young to die. And we had to scramble because they were seen as a problem in society, and we created this idea of this stage of life as the golden years, as a time of leisure and recreation, essentially a second adolescence. Graying is playing. But it turns out the first adolescence, which incidentally was invented by a 60-year-old, was also created only 100 years ago. We invented youth at the beginning of the 20th century. G. Stanley Hall, the person who wrote the definitive text about defining adolescence, did so because we had a bunch of neither nors then. Just like now we have all these people who are neither young nor old, then we had all these young people who were neither children nor adults. We were worried about them. We were worried they had physical maturity but emotional immaturity. So we created a moratorium period called youth. It took us 40 years to invent the word teenager, which was created in 1944 with the advent of 17 magazine. As it turns out, Hall was the first person to propose a new stage of life between midlife and old age. 20 years after inventing adolescence, he said, I made a big mistake. I should have created a new stage of life in this latter part. And he had a poetic turn. He called it an Indian summer. And he said human beings didn't reach the height of their capacity until the shadows started slanting eastward. And I think what he meant is that people at this juncture have this unique relationship with time. There's time lived, the experience that goes with it, but also a sense of the compression of time, that you can see the end from here, that there are fewer years ahead than there are behind, and that changes your priorities. You ask questions about what matters most. And so today, as we have so many people flooding in this period who have both wisdom and capacity, time lived, time left to live, I think we can fashion a stage of life that goes beyond the second adolescence that we've had for the last 50 years and amounts essentially to a first maturity, a chance to use this great gift of time in a way that's not only personally meaningful, but that means something beyond ourselves. And it's no surprise in this context that already millions of people are doing that. William Gibson, the science fiction writer, has a wonderful line. He says, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Already 9 million Americans have moved into what I call encore careers, essentially second acts focused on social impact at the intersection of passion, purpose, and a paycheck. It's essentially the practical idealism that's at the hybrid of the spirit of service and the continued need for income and work. 31 million more people in this period say it's a priority to follow in their footsteps. I think we need to embrace a vision for this period, but also all the social innovation that goes with creating a new stage of life. Just think of aging in this country. In the last 50 years, we invented not only retirement communities, Medicare, AARP, expanded Social Security, senior centers, lifelong learning, all in a very brief period of time. I think we need to go back to the drawing board and do the same for this flood of boomers that are entering this phase now. I think we have to come up with a better name for this period. Hall called it senescence, which probably says something about why it didn't catch on. My mother-in-law, who's wonderful with words, gave me an alternative. She told me that she's on her next to last dog. The way she figures it, she's got about 6 years left in her current Cocker Spaniel, and she could probably get a mid-size for another 14 years. And you know, we're used to measuring life in dog years, so maybe she's on to something. Whatever we call it, and however we shape this period, if we do it around the sense of purpose and contribution, of continued growth, I think we can turn that paradox, that longevity paradox, that notion of graying as playing or paying, into the payoff that it should be. I think we can unleash a windfall of human capital really comparable only to the movement of so many millions of women in the 60s and 70s into roles that had been off limits to their mother's generation. We know today we'd barely be able to survive economically, socially without this extraordinary reservoir of talent. I think 20, 30 years down the road, we'll think the same thing about people in this stage of life. And I think ultimately we can do something even more important, which is that we can get back to human nature. There's a psychiatrist at Harvard named George Valiant who writes, biology flows downhill. You know, that's how we were set up as human beings. As you move towards the latter part of life, you're not supposed to pretend that you're still young. You're supposed to be there for people who really are young. You're supposed to invest in the future. Erik Erikson, who is one of the great scholars of adult development, said that the hallmark of success in this period could be encapsulated in the phrase, I am what survives of me. And I think we've lost that when we send our older people off to age-segregated playgrounds in the desert. I think as a society, we've lost that sense of future-mindedness, that it is all about future generations. That's always been the American dream, the immigrant dream. But fortunately, with this flood of people in this period who have these bonus years, I think there's a chance for them not just to leave a legacy, but to live one. And in doing so, they can leave a big legacy, which is a stage of life that all of you can look forward to inhabiting. Half the children born since the year 2000 are going to see their 100th birthday across the developed world. Let's make that the triumph that it should be, and a benefit for all that will resonate for generations to come. Thank you.